There we go. Okay, thanks. My title, of course, is an allusion to Gregory Bateson's best-known work, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and the topic itself is a tribute to Christine Nystrom, whose work centered on the concept of meaning, and who also wrote the first major treatise on media ecology, as well as working within the discipline of general semantics. So now, the term semantics is intimately bound up with the concept of meaning and also definition, and meanings and definitions, while synonymous, are not quite the same thing. I may look up the word meaning in the dictionary and find that it means definition, and then look up the word definition, find that it means meaning. And this is the long-standing criticism of that. In other words, definitions are tautological, dictionaries are closed systems, words defined by other words, which are defined by the first words, and so on and on and on, which is why a foreign language dictionary is useless if you don't know the language already. So what then do we mean by meaning? Our first step might be to consult the aptly titled book, The Meaning of Meaning, co-authored by C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards, published back in 1923. And there they present the basic model of the semantic triangle, which goes beyond the simplistic notion that words stand for things. Instead, the model indicates that their relationship is indirect, at least when we talk about words and symbols, and that their relationship is imputed, in effect mediated, by way of thought or reference. Also importantly is, as opposed to Saussure's emphasis on the relationship between signifier and signified, what's especially significant about the semantic triangle is the inclusion of the referent, which can be understood as the thing referred to, the thing or object or event that exists out there in the world independently of the individual, of the symbol, but of course in relation to the individual. So the symbol in this model is the outward manifestation of the sign. The thought or reference is the inner conception or meaning. So that's the first step. Now the second step is to understand that Korzybski was aware of this model and judged it inadequate, along with the term meaning itself. Part of the problem is the implication that meaning resides in the symbol, in the word, rather than in people. That meaning is a thing rather than an activity. And as a gerund, it does indicate it's something that we do, but we treat it as if it's a substance of some kind. For Korzybski, meaning is a function of the level of abstracting that we're engaged in, and the context are, as he put it, the neurosemantic and neurolinguistic environment. It's become something of a cliche to say then that general semantics is not semantics. We say that over and over. It's not semantics, and that the two should not be confused. And whereas semantics is about meaning, for Korzybski, general semantics is about evaluation. And importantly, in place of the term meaning, Korzybski used the phrase semantic reaction. We can therefore recognize that from that Korzybski's general semantics is based on behaviorism. And in fact, in that long list of people that Science and Sanity is dedicated to, that includes Aristotle, is Ivan Pavlov. And in fact, this Korzybski's drawing on Ivan Pavlov's model of stimulus response. As you may recall, Pavlov's famous experiment showed that dogs who naturally salivate when presented with meat could learn to associate the ringing of the bell with the presence of meat and eventually salivate just at the sound of the bell alone with no meat present. The presence of meat, presumably the sight and the smell of it, are signals of the meat itself, and salivation is a response to that stimulus, which it's otherwise referred to as a signal reaction. For the dogs, the bell becomes a signal as well, and elicits a similar signal reaction. A signal is perceived to be directly connected to what it represents, and a signal reaction is an immediate reflex reaction. So for Pavlov, a symbol is a signal of a signal, a self-reflexive signal. And that distance, signal of a signal, means that it's not directly connected to what it represents. Instead, a symbol, as a signal of a signal, a symbol is, we understand that the connection is arbitrary, which is why we can use completely different sounds to represent the same meanings and reference in different languages. And they only mean what they mean because they are conventional. That is, a group of people agree that they mean what they mean, that they mean the same thing. And whereas a signal reaction is immediate reflex reaction, a symbol reaction then is delayed and reflective, which means it involves processing, decoding, interpreting. Now, it would be easy enough to conclude then that signals ought to elicit signal reactions and symbols ought to elicit symbol reactions. And when the responses do not match the stimuli, problems occur. This is true some of the time, but not all of the time. One of the evolutionary advantages of symbol use is the ability to elicit signal reactions in situations that require a quick response. So, for example, if I yell, "Look out!" or "duck," and that allows you to act without thinking and avoid getting hit in the head, that's great, right? That's a signal reaction to a symbol. Along similar lines, a symbol reaction to a signal can be quite advantageous. For example, you smell smoke, and rather than running in panic away from it in a knee-jerk fashion, you think, well, what should I do? What's the best course of action to address the situation? So signal reactions and symbol reactions are two different types of semantic reactions, and they indicate that the meaning is in us, the reaction is in us, not in the signal or symbol. It's in the response, not in the stimulus. So now, that's the second step. The third step is that for Nystrom, the important reconciliation, comes via George Herbert Mead in his 1934 work, Mind, Self, and Society, subtitled From the Standpoint of a Social Behaviorist. That's the book that introduced symbolic interactionism. And rather than treat the mind as a black box, as other behaviorists did, that has to be set aside, for Mead, it was entirely possible to include mental activity as a form of behavior, the activity of thinking, and mind as behavioral phenomena. And it follows that the meaning of meaning is that it is a response to a stimulus, a behavioral response to a stimulus, whether that response is observable behavior in the form of an external action, or that response is mental activity in the form of information processing and cognition, internal feelings and thoughts. The stimulus itself may be external, but it can also be internal, an internal stimulus, and as a reaction to our own activity, we can also react to our own reactions in self-reflective fashion and react to our reactions to our reactions. And it's certainly possible to understand how reacting to one's own reactions can lead to an awareness of self, of mind, and of consciousness, the formation of self-consciousness. Simply having the ability to think about ourselves allows us to imagine ourselves as if from outside of ourselves, to imagine stepping outside of our own subjectivity, and then it becomes possible to imagine seeing ourselves as someone else may see it, to imagine how someone else may react to our reactions, to predict how they may react to our reactions, to generalize how others may react to our actions, and plan accordingly. In this way, self-reflexive responses unlock our capacity for empathy, which involves a degree of projection and projecting ourselves into the other, and it accounts for the evolutionary attribute of theory of mind, that human beings, for the most part, develop the theory that others have minds just like we ourselves have minds. So empathy and theory of mind underscore the powerful presence of identification in human symbolic activity. Korzybski addressed the problematic aspects of identification, of identity, and advocating for non-identity in general semantics, whereas on the other side of the coin, rhetorician Kenneth Burke maintained that identification is the main function of rhetoric and human communication. It's really the two sides of the same coin. So now, the fourth step is to understand that meaning can be understood as a spectrum of responses to various stimuli. The responses may be immediate, automatic, and active signal reactions, or they may be delayed, reflective, thoughtful, symbol reactions, or they may fall somewhere in between the two poles, that there can be a whole spectrum to understand. And so what makes a symbol and not a signal, it's not something inherent in the stimulus itself, it's in the response to the stimulus. That's what makes it a symbol. For Suzanne Langer, human beings make meaning from art as well as language. They make meaning from music, from images, even making meaning in the process of sense perception. Even sense perception, she argues, is symbolic for human beings. Behind all of these different forms is the basic human ability for human beings to engage in symbolic transformation. That's Langer's phrase, and that's akin to, it's the equivalent of Korzybski's semantic reaction. And for Langer, and this is Alexander Durig interpreting her, I think he put it very nicely, quote from Durig, "Language is not the medium of meaning, meaning is the medium of language." So it's the meaning that makes the symbol, not the symbol that makes the meaning. That's why Nystrom, following Langer, argues that human beings by our very nature, are meaning makers. And we just go around making meaning out of everything that we encounter. We are symbolic first responders. Meaning is a construction not out of whole cloth, but out of the raw material of the environment, the process being based, that meaning-making process being based on learning and experience and on culture and intersubjectivity based on it. So now, the fifth step is that understanding meaning as a behavioral phenomenon allows for a rapprochement between meaning and information based on the perspective of information theory. As put forth by Claude Shannon, information theory allows us to measure the complexity of a message system, but it's not sufficient to decipher its meanings. But information is still about a response to a stimulus. Simply put, the function of information is to reduce uncertainty in the receiver. And so uncertainty reduction is a type of semantic reaction. It's the receiver's uncertainty that is reduced or eliminated. Or as Gregory Bateson puts it, information is news. And it's only news if it's news to me or if it's news to you. Information is news about difference, or as Bateson put it, it's a difference that makes a difference. The recognition of difference, just acknowledging it, taking that in, is at its core the most basic of semantic reactions, of signal reactions. It's just perceiving difference. Now, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics can also be helpful here in recognizing that feedback loops form in ongoing interactions, so that the response to a stimulus may serve as a stimulus that elicits more responses, which also become stimuli continuing on indefinitely. And at a certain point, it may be difficult, even impossible, to differentiate stimulus from response. They're working in both ways, so that what we have is a system composed of interdependent parts interacting with one another. And with this, we arrive at Bateson's ecology of mind, and based on that, an ecology of meaning. In the stimulus-response relationship, the system is often reacting to its environment, and the response is in some sense an adaptation to the environment. Now, in this regard, Paul Watzlawick and his colleagues, and it's based on Bateson, are popularizing Bateson's views. They explain that biological functioning in its most basic form is all about communication. So I quote from Watzlawick's Pragmatics of Human Communication. He writes, "Norbert Wiener once said about the world that it may be viewed as a myriad of to whom it may concern messages." And then Watzlawick goes on to explain that, and I quote, "The impact of the environment on an organism comprises a set of instructions whose meaning is by no means self-evident, but rather is left up to the organism to decode as best it can. If to this consideration we add the obvious fact that the organism's reactions in turn affect the environment, it becomes apparent that even on the very primitive levels of life, complex and continuous interactions take place that are non-random and are therefore governed by a program, or to use an existentialist term, by meaning." So the organism receives messages, which is to say information from the environment, because the environment is characterized by difference instead of sameness. A stimulus, any stimulus, constitutes news about difference, and to the extent that it elicits a response, it's a difference that makes a difference. There are the differences that are present in the biophysical environment. There are the differences that originate from the organism's effects on the biophysical environment. And there are the differences that exist solely in the interior landscape of the mind. So now the sixth and final step is to relate the ecology of meaning to the ecology of media, both of which were central to Christine Nystrom's work. To do so, it's essential to recall that the terms medium and environment are synonymous. The behavioral view that meaning is a response to a stimulus does not imply, again, that meaning is a complete fabrication from within, but rather it's a product of a transaction, interaction, transaction with an external phenomenon. The meaning is not inherent in the external phenomenon. It's produced by the response to the external phenomenon. It's constructed out of the raw material provided by the external phenomenon. And this is a process that is learned. It's developed socially and culturally, which is to say, again, intersubjectively. What remains objective is the stimulus itself, and the source of the stimulus, the environment or medium. The medium then is the stimulus. It is the source of differences that make a difference. It's the code and the constraints for making meaning. And it is out of that stimuli originating from the medium that we make meaning. The medium, in other words, is the message, and its meaning is in us. Thank you.